They told me you might not remember me, the man said softly as I opened my eyes, and that was the moment I realized my children were nowhere to be found. The hospital room was dim except for the steady green glow of the heart monitor beside my bed, blinking in patient rhythm, as if it had more loyalty to me than my own family. I remember the antiseptic smell in the air and the way the thin cotton blanket barely warmed my legs. Just 12 hours earlier, my son Daniel had stood at this very bedside, promising he would be right back after grabbing coffee from the cafe downstairs. My daughter Emily had kissed my forehead and said, "Try to rest, Mom. We're not going anywhere." But when I woke up after the procedure, the chair near the window was empty, their half-finished cups gone, their voices replaced by silence. I checked the clock on the wall. 7:40 p.m. visiting hours were nearly over. No missed calls on my phone. No texts. Just a low battery warning blinking in the corner of the screen. I told myself they were stuck in traffic or arguing with parking validation or handling some urgent work call. I have always been good at making excuses for my children. It's a skill mothers learn early and never quite unlearn. The nurse came in to check my vitals and asked gently, "Is anyone staying with you tonight, Mrs. Whitmore?" I forced a smile and said, "They'll be back." Even as I said it, I knew I was speaking more to myself than to her. That was when I noticed him sitting quietly in the corner chair I hadn't seen before. A man in his late 60s, neatly dressed in a navy jacket, hands folded as if he had been waiting for a long time. He stood when our eyes met. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was steady, warm, familiar in a way that unsettled me. "The nurses said it was all right for me to sit with you." I searched my memory. His face carried something I almost recognized, a shadow of a younger man I had once known, but the connection wouldn't form. "Do I know you?" I asked. He stepped closer to the bed and, after a brief hesitation, took my hand in both of his. His grip was firm. Respectful, not invasive. Just steady. "You might," he replied. "But not the way you think." Outside the window, the city lights flickered against the darkening sky. I could see the red glow of brake lights on the highway about half a mile away, cars moving somewhere with purpose, families heading home for dinner. My family was nowhere in sight. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the procedure. 2 days earlier, Daniel had been talking about selling my house again. "It's too much for you, Mom. The stairs, the yard, the maintenance. You could get a nice condo. Something manageable." Laura, my daughter-in-law, had nodded enthusiastically, already scrolling through listings on her phone as if my agreement were guaranteed. I had lived in that house for 48 years. I planted the oak tree in the front yard the summer Emily turned 5. I measured Daniel's height against the pantry door frame until he left for college. But suddenly, in their eyes, it was just real estate. "You've been forgetting things," Daniel added carefully. "We're just worried." I wasn't forgetting things. I was remembering too much. I remembered the late-night calls asking for help with mortgage payments. The check I wrote for Emily's business that quietly closed a year later. The times I babysat for weeks so Laura and Daniel could take their trips to Napa or the Caribbean. I never kept score. Mothers don't. Or at least we tell ourselves we don't. The man beside my hospital bed squeezed my hand gently, bringing me back to the present. "They signed the preliminary papers yesterday," he said. My heart skipped. "What papers?" He studied my face carefully, as if measuring how much I could handle. "For temporary guardianship." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and deliberate. Guardianship. As if I were a child. As if I couldn't manage my own affairs. "There must be a mistake," I said, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. He shook his head slowly. "There isn't." The monitor beside me continued its steady beep, indifferent to the shift happening inside me. I stared at this stranger who claimed to know something about my life that I did not. "Who are you?" I asked again, this time more firmly. His eyes softened. "My name is Thomas Hale," he said. "And I think it's time you knew why your husband kept certain things from you. At the mention of my late husband, something inside me froze. Harold had been gone for 7 years, yet his presence still lingered in every room of my house, in every habit I hadn't been able to break. What does my husband have to do with any of this? I whispered. Thomas took a slow breath, as if crossing an invisible line. Because I'm not just a family friend, he said quietly. And you were never supposed to find out like this. I looked toward the empty doorway, half expecting Daniel or Emily to walk in and explain everything away. But the hallway remained still, fluorescent lights humming overhead. My children had left me alone in a hospital room, believing I was too weak to notice what they were planning. Yet here was a man I had never met, holding my hand as if I mattered. And for the first time since waking up, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever truth he was about to reveal would change the shape of my family forever. Thomas did not answer my question immediately. He looked toward the hallway as if making sure no one else was within earshot, then pulled his chair closer to the bed. The wheels made a soft scraping sound against the tile floor, loud in the stillness of the room. I could hear the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant roll of a supply cart somewhere down the corridor. Your husband and I shared more than a passing acquaintance, he said at last. We shared blood. The words did not register at first. I stared at him, waiting for clarification, for a punchline, for something that would make sense of the strange weight in his voice. I do not understand, I replied carefully. Thomas nodded, as if he expected that. Harold was my father. The air seemed to thin around me. My husband, steady and dependable Harold Whitmore, a man who never missed a mortgage payment and never forgot an anniversary, had a son I had never known about. I searched Thomas's face again, this time not for familiarity but for resemblance. The line of his jaw. The shape of his eyes. There it was, faint but undeniable. I felt as though someone had quietly rearranged the furniture of my entire life without asking permission. That is not possible, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Harold would have told me. Thomas lowered his gaze briefly. He tried. More than once. But the timing was never right. And when my mother passed away, he thought it would only bring pain. I let that settle between us. 50 years of marriage, and there had been a chapter one never read. Yet I did not feel anger the way I might have expected. What I felt instead was a slow, dawning realization that perhaps I had not been as informed about my family as I believed. Why are you here now? I asked. Thomas exhaled slowly. Because Daniel contacted me 3 weeks ago. My heart tightened again at the sound of my son's name. He said he needed my signature. For what? For the transfer of certain shares your husband left in trust. My hands went cold despite the hospital blanket tucked around me. Transfer to whom? Thomas met my eyes directly. To Daniel. The steady beep of the monitor continued, each sound marking the seconds of a truth I had not been invited to. I thought back to the conversations in my kitchen, the careful tone Daniel used when discussing my so-called memory lapses. The way Laura had suggested assisted living brochures with the same enthusiasm she used for vacation planning. It had all felt premature, slightly exaggerated. Now it felt strategic. He said you were declining, Thomas continued gently. That you were confused about your finances. That it would be safer for him to manage everything. I let out a breath that felt like it had been building for years. I was 72, not incapacitated. I still balanced my checkbook every month. I still drove myself to church and to the grocery store. I still remembered every birthday in the family without a reminder. The narrative they were building did not match the woman I knew myself to be. Did you sign anything? I asked. Thomas shook his head. No. I requested to see you first. The simplicity of that sentence landed harder than any accusation. A man I had never met refused to sign documents about my life without speaking to me directly, while my own children had already begun the process without even informing me. The hospital evaluation is part of it, Thomas added quietly. Temporary guardianship requires a medical opinion. The Pieces aligned with unsettling precision. My sudden procedure. Daniel's insistence that I have it done at this particular hospital. The urgency. I had trusted his concern, grateful that my son still seemed attentive. Now I wondered whether the timing had been convenient. Why would Harold leave you shares? I asked after a moment, my voice steadier than I felt. Thomas offered a faint smile. Because he believed responsibility should be shared. He told me once that you were the strongest person he ever knew. That if anything ever felt wrong, I should make sure you saw the truth before it was too late. I looked at the ceiling, at the faint crack running across one of the tiles. Harold had always been deliberate. If he arranged something, there was intention behind it. I had simply never known the full scope of it. They left me here tonight, I said softly, more to myself than to Thomas. They said they would be right back. Thomas's grip tightened slightly around my hand. You are not alone. The phrase sounded almost rehearsed, yet it carried more sincerity than the promises I had heard earlier that day. Outside my room, a nurse laughed at something someone said. Life moved forward without hesitation. Families gathered around beds, holding hands, whispering reassurances. Mine had left before visiting hours ended. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, how he used to climb into our bed after a thunderstorm, how fiercely he held my arm until he fell asleep. I had been his safe place. Somewhere along the way, safety had turned into control. If they believe I am incapable, I said slowly, then they do not know me at all. Thomas nodded. Then perhaps it is time they do. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not panic, but clarity. For years I had brushed aside subtle dismissals, assuming they were temporary misunderstandings. Tonight stripped away that illusion. My children believed I was too fragile to question them. They had underestimated one simple fact. I was still listening. And now, for the first time, I had someone willing to speak. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel standing at the foot of my hospital bed, speaking in that careful tone he used when he believed he was being reasonable. I replayed the past few months in slow detail, as if my mind were flipping through old photographs. The small corrections he made when I told a story. The way Laura would finish my sentences for me, smiling as though she were helping. The time Emily gently suggested that I should consider giving Daniel access to my checking account, just in case. At the time, I had interpreted it as concern. Now it felt like preparation. The heart monitor beside me continued its steady rhythm, a mechanical reminder that I was still very much alive and aware. Around 9:30 in the evening, a different nurse came in to adjust my medication. She asked again if a family member would be staying overnight. I hesitated before answering. No, I said finally. But I have someone who will be handling my paperwork. The word surprised even me. Thomas remained seated quietly by the window, reading something on his phone but looking up every few minutes to check on me. There was something grounding about his presence. Not intrusive. Not dramatic. Simply steady. It struck me how strange it was that comfort had come from a man I had known for less than 2 hours. Tell me exactly what Daniel requested, I said after the nurse left. Thomas leaned forward slightly. He submitted a petition for temporary guardianship last week, he explained. It cites concerns about cognitive decline and financial vulnerability. He listed several recent incidents as examples. I felt a flicker of disbelief. What incidents? Thomas looked uncomfortable. He mentioned that you misplaced a deposit slip in March and that you forgot to confirm a dinner reservation in April. I almost laughed, though there was nothing amusing about it. I misplaced a deposit slip because the bank teller distracted me, I replied. And the restaurant canceled that reservation themselves because of a plumbing issue. The idea that these ordinary inconveniences had been repurposed as evidence against me was both absurd and chilling. He also noted the recent medical procedure, Thomas continued carefully. He argued that it demonstrated increased fragility. I stared at the ceiling again. The procedure had been recommended after a routine checkup. A minor cardiac intervention, the doctor had called it. Standard for someone my age, preventative rather than urgent. Daniel had insisted on scheduling it immediately. It is better to handle it now, Mom, he had said. No need to wait. I remembered signing the consent forms in my kitchen while Laura stood beside him, both of them unusually attentive. I had been touched by their involvement. Now I wondered whether the timing had been strategic. When is the hearing? I asked quietly. In 10 days, Thomas answered. 10 days. That was how long my children believed it would take to legally redefine my independence. 10 days to transform me from matriarch to dependent. I turned my head toward Thomas. And Harold left you shares in the company? I asked. Thomas nodded. A minority percentage, but enough to require my signature for a full transfer. He structured it that way intentionally. I felt a slow warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the hospital blankets. Harold had always thought several steps ahead. Even in business matters, he believed in balance. If he had arranged this, it meant he anticipated the possibility that power might concentrate too narrowly. Perhaps he had seen something in Daniel that I had not wanted to see. Why did Daniel think you would cooperate? I asked. Thomas gave a small, measured smile. He assumed loyalty would follow blood. The sentence lingered in the room. Blood. Family. Words that had once felt solid and unquestionable now seemed more complicated. I had spent my life believing that devotion to one another was automatic. That motherhood created an unbreakable thread. Yet here I was, in a hospital bed, while my children prepared documents that described me as incapable. What do you suggest? I asked finally. Thomas folded his hands thoughtfully. First, you recover. Second, you obtain your own legal counsel. Third, you review every financial document signed in the past 6 months. His tone was calm, methodical. There was no urgency in his voice, only strategy. I appreciated that. Panic would not serve me. Clarity would. A cleaning staff member pushed a cart past my doorway, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. The hospital operated on routine and procedure, each step documented and verified. My own family, it seemed, had relied on assumptions and silence. They believe I am weak, I said after a moment. Thomas looked at me directly. They believe you will not question them. I considered that carefully. For years I had prioritized harmony over confrontation. If Daniel spoke over me, I let it pass. If Laura made decisions about holiday plans without consulting me, I adjusted. I told myself flexibility was grace. Perhaps they had mistaken grace for frailty. I am not confused, I said slowly. I am disappointed. The distinction mattered. Confusion suggests inability. Disappointment suggests awareness. Thomas inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a point in a business negotiation. Then we proceed accordingly, he replied. I closed my eyes again, not to sleep but to think. 10 days was not much time, but it was enough. Enough to gather records. Enough to consult an attorney. Enough to remind my children that aging did not erase authority. When I opened my eyes once more, the room felt different. Still quiet. Still sterile. But no longer lonely. My children had left believing I would remain unaware of their plans. They had miscalculated one crucial detail. I was listening now. And this time, I intended to answer. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through the narrow hospital window in a pale gray wash that made everything look softer than it felt. I had not slept much, but I felt clear, almost sharpened by the events of the night before. The nurse brought oatmeal and weak coffee on a plastic tray, and I ate methodically, as if proving something to myself. My hands were steady. My thoughts were organized. I asked for a pen and paper and began listing dates. March, the deposit slip. April, the cancelled reservation. June, the cardiology appointment Daniel insisted we schedule immediately. When Thomas returned from the cafeteria with a fresh cup of coffee for himself, he paused when he saw the list in my lap. "Good," he said quietly. "Documentation matters." I nodded without looking up. "So does memory." Around 10 in the morning, Daniel finally appeared in the doorway. He looked composed, well-rested, dressed in the same pressed button-down shirt he wore to client meetings. Laura stood just behind him, her expression carefully arranged between concern and efficiency. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping inside with practiced warmth. "How are you feeling?" I studied his face for signs of guilt or hesitation. I found none. "Clear," I replied. "Very clear." Laura placed a bouquet of grocery store flowers on the side table and adjusted the water pitcher as if tending to details could erase the previous night. "We were here late," she said gently. "You were asleep, and visiting hours ended." I held her gaze. "You told me you were getting coffee." Daniel shifted slightly. "We did, but then we received a call about the paperwork." It felt urgent. The word paperwork hung between us, sterile and revealing. "What paperwork?" I asked evenly. He glanced at Laura before answering. "Just some preliminary documents in case you need additional support after discharge. We want to make sure everything is handled smoothly." Smoothly. As if I were a project timeline rather than a person. I folded my list and set it on the tray beside me. "And what exactly requires support?" Daniel smiled in a way that might have seemed reassuring to an outsider. "Mom, you have been under a lot of stress. The house, the finances, your health. We are only trying to lighten the load." I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the performance Thomas had described. Concern packaged as authority. "I have managed the house for 48 years, I said quietly. I balanced the books when your father traveled for work. I paid off the mortgage 5 years early. What part of that suggests I cannot manage now?" Laura stepped in gently. "It is not about capability. It is about prevention. We just want to avoid mistakes." Mistakes. I thought of the oak tree in my yard, now nearly 50 feet tall, roots deep and unshaken by ordinary storms. No one suggested removing it because it might drop a leaf. "Have you filed for guardianship?" I asked directly. Daniel froze for half a second before recovering. "It is only temporary," he said. "Standard procedure when someone undergoes cardiac intervention at your age." "My cardiologist did not mention any cognitive concerns," I replied. His jaw tightened slightly. Doctors do not always see the full picture. Before I could respond, Thomas stepped forward from the window where he had been standing quietly. "Good morning, Daniel," he said evenly. Daniel turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Thomas," he said slowly. "I did not realize you would be here." "I thought it appropriate," Thomas replied. "Given the circumstances." Laura's posture shifted, her polite composure thinning. "This is a private family matter," she said. Thomas met her gaze without hostility. "It became my matter when you requested my signature." Silence filled the room, thicker than the hospital air. I watched my son carefully. He looked from me to Thomas and back again, recalculating. "Mom," he said finally, lowering his voice. "We discussed this. You agreed that simplifying the trust would be beneficial." "I agreed to review options," I corrected. "Not to surrender control." The distinction seemed to irritate him. "You are overreacting," he said. "We are protecting you." I felt something inside me settle into place, like a key turning in a lock. "Protection does not require secrecy," I answered. "And concern does not begin with legal petitions." Laura crossed her arms lightly, the bouquet on the table already beginning to tilt to one side. "We thought you would understand," she said. "We did not want to upset you unnecessarily." I looked at both of them, really looked. These were the children I raised, the ones I stayed up with during fevers, the ones whose college tuition I supplemented without complaint. Somewhere between gratitude and entitlement, the lines had blurred. "You left me alone last night," I said quietly. Daniel's expression hardened. "You were sleeping." "I was not," I replied. The room fell silent again. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, the distant chime of an elevator opening. Life continued outside our small confrontation. "The hearing is in 10 days, I added calmly. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He had not expected me to know that. "Mom," he began, but I raised my hand gently. "If you truly believe I am incapable, then you should have no objection to an independent evaluation and full financial audit." Laura inhaled sharply. "That is unnecessary." "No," I said softly. "It is necessary." For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Uncertain. I realized then that they had counted on my silence more than my weakness. And silence, once broken, does not return easily. Daniel did not stay long after that. He muttered something about speaking with his attorney and left with Laura close behind him, the bouquet of flowers still leaning awkwardly on the table as if it, too, felt out of place. When the door closed, the room seemed to expand. I released a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Thomas remained where he was, hands loosely clasped in front of him. "You handled that well," he said. I gave a faint nod. "I handled it late," I replied. "That is different." By early afternoon, the cardiologist stopped by to review my chart. He explained that the procedure had gone smoothly and that I would likely be discharged the following morning. I asked him directly whether he had observed any cognitive impairment during my evaluations. He looked mildly surprised. "None whatsoever, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Your responses were clear and consistent." I thanked him and asked if he would be willing to document that in writing. He agreed without hesitation. After he left, I looked at Thomas. "They counted on a narrative," I said quietly. "We will give them facts instead." Thomas nodded. Facts tend to age better than narratives. Later that afternoon, Emily called. Her voice was lighter than Daniel's had been, almost apologetic. "Mom, Daniel said things got tense this morning," she began. I listened without interrupting. "We are just worried about you," she continued. "You know how people talk. Neighbors notice when you forget appointments." I closed my eyes briefly. "Which appointments, Emily?" There was a pause. "Well, the garden club luncheon last month." "That luncheon was cancelled due to a thunderstorm," I replied. "I have the email confirmation." Silence stretched between us. "You do not have to prove anything to me," she said quickly. "I am only trying to keep the peace." Peace. That word again. Peace had become a convenient substitute for honesty. "Peace without truth is not peace," I answered gently. "It is avoidance." Emily sighed. "Daniel thinks you are being influenced." I almost smiled at that. "By whom?" "By outsiders," she said carefully. "People who do not understand our family." I glanced at Thomas, who stood by the window speaking quietly on his phone with what I assumed was an attorney. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "outsiders see what family chooses not to." Emily did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a trace of uncertainty I had not heard before. "Are you really going to fight this?" she asked. I considered the question. Fight implied hostility. I did not feel hostile. I felt resolute. "I am going to clarify it," I said. "That is different." After we hung up, I asked Thomas about securing independent counsel. Within an hour, he arranged a consultation with a senior attorney named Margaret Ellis, a woman in her early 60s who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. She arrived just before visiting hours ended, carrying a slim leather folder and a calm, direct manner that reminded me of myself at a younger age. She listened carefully as I explained the petition for guardianship, the trust shares, and the timing of my procedure. She asked precise questions about dates and documents. When I finished, she leaned back slightly. The petition relies heavily on perception, she said. Perception can be dismantled. I felt a steady warmth build in my chest. What do you recommend? I asked. First, we file a formal objection to the guardianship. Second, we request a comprehensive independent medical evaluation. Third, we audit the trust structure and freeze any pending transfers until the hearing. Her tone was measured, not dramatic. Strategy, not emotion. I nodded. And if they argue that I am being manipulated? I asked. Margaret Ellis gave a small, almost amused smile. Then we asked them to define manipulation under oath. There was something reassuring about her confidence. After she left, I felt tired but steady. The hospital room no longer felt like a place of vulnerability. It felt like a starting point. As evening approached, Daniel sent a brief text message. We should talk tomorrow before you sign anything. I read it twice. The implication was clear. He still believed the final decision rested with him. I set the phone down without responding. Thomas looked at me. You do not have to engage tonight, he said. I shook my head. No. Tonight I rest. For years I had assumed that love required endless accommodation. That motherhood meant smoothing conflicts before they formed. But lying there beneath the soft hum of hospital lights, I understood something I had not allowed myself to consider before. Accommodation without boundaries invites erasure. My children had not intended to erase me entirely. They simply believed they could reshape me into something more convenient. What they did not anticipate was that convenience ends where conviction begins. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor beside me. Tomorrow I would leave this hospital not as a patient to be managed but as a woman prepared. And preparation, unlike fear, does not waver easily. The discharge papers were signed just after 9 the next morning, and I walked out of the hospital with measured steps, not because I was weak, but because I was thinking. Daniel had offered to pick me up, but I declined. Thomas drove instead, his sedan clean and understated, the kind of car that did not call attention to itself. As we pulled onto the highway, I watched the hospital building shrink in the rearview mirror. 2 days earlier I had entered it as a patient. I was leaving it as a witness. They will escalate, Thomas said calmly as we merged into traffic. When people feel control slipping, they often do. I nodded, watching the lane stretch ahead of us. Then we move first, I replied. My house came into view 20 minutes later, the oak tree in the front yard casting a long shadow across the driveway. I had planted that tree with Harold when it was barely 3 feet tall. Now it stood taller than the roofline, steady and unapologetic. Inside, everything looked exactly as I had left it. The pale blue armchair near the window. The framed photographs lining the hallway. The faint scent of lemon polish on the dining table. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. I set my purse down and walked slowly through each room, not out of confusion, but out of intention. I was reacquainting myself with the ground I stood on. Thomas waited in the kitchen while I retrieved a small metal box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were copies of financial statements, trust documents, and the original deed to the house. I placed them neatly on the kitchen table. Harold organized everything chronologically, I said. He believed clarity prevented conflict. Thomas began reviewing the folders, his movements precise. Your husband anticipated future pressure, he observed. He structured the trust to require multiple signatures for any major transfer. Daniel cannot move forward without cooperation. I poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from him. He will try to argue urgency, I said. He always does when he wants something done quickly. Thomas gave a faint smile. Urgency often disguises ambition. By noon, Margaret Ellis called to confirm she had filed the formal objection to the guardianship petition. She also scheduled an independent neurological evaluation for later that week. The more transparent you are, the stronger your position becomes, she said over the phone. Transparency. That word felt clean compared to the language Daniel had been using. Simplify. Protect. Manage. All of it implied reduction. Transparency implied strength. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, Daniel arrived unannounced. I saw his car pull into the driveway through the living room window. He entered without knocking, using the spare key he had kept for years. I made a mental note of that. "Mom," he began, stepping into the kitchen. "Why did you involve outside counsel without talking to me?" His tone was controlled but edged. I folded my hands on the table. "Because you involved the court without talking to me," I replied evenly. He glanced at Thomas, who remained seated but attentive. "This is getting out of hand," Daniel said. "You are being influenced by someone who benefits from prolonging this." I felt no surge of anger, only clarity. "The only person who benefits from haste is the one who seeks it," I answered. "Explain to me why you filed for guardianship before discussing it with me openly." He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something I had not allowed myself to see before. Calculation. "I was trying to prevent complications," he said finally. "Your memory has not been consistent. Cite one example that withstands documentation," I said calmly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched between us. "You misplaced that deposit slip," he said at last. "I have the corrected receipt," I replied. "And the bank statement." His shoulders stiffened. "This is unnecessary," he insisted. "You are 72 years old." "And fully competent," I answered. "Age does not nullify autonomy." Laura appeared at the doorway then, her expression tighter than usual. "We are only thinking ahead," she said. "In case something happens." I stood slowly, steady on my feet. "Something already happened," I said. "You left me alone in a hospital room while filing documents that questioned my capacity." The words did not rise in volume, but they landed with weight. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he had used since adolescence when frustrated. "We thought you would agree," he muttered. "You did not ask," I replied. "Agreement requires conversation." Thomas finally spoke, his tone measured. "The hearing remains scheduled in 9 days. Until then, no assets will move." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You are turning this into a battle," he said. I shook my head slowly. "No. I am turning it into a record. There is a difference between fighting and documenting. Fighting is emotional. Documentation is factual." I watched my son absorb that distinction. He had assumed authority would shift quietly, like furniture rearranged overnight. Instead, he found resistance rooted in preparation. "I will speak with my attorney," he said stiffly. "Please do," I replied. He left without another word, Laura following closely behind him. The front door closed with a final click. The house felt still again, but not fragile. I walked to the window and looked at the oak tree outside, its branches unmoved by the mild afternoon breeze. For years I had equated love with yielding. Today I understood that love also required structure. Harold had built safeguards into our finances. I was now building them into my boundaries. And boundaries, once set, do not apologize for existing. The house felt different the morning after Daniel left, not quieter, but clearer. I woke before sunrise, the way I used to when Harold had early flights, and stood at the kitchen sink watching the first light stretch across the backyard. The grass was damp with dew, the oak tree steady as ever. For decades I had measured my days by other people's needs. School schedules. Business dinners. Holiday plans arranged around everyone else's availability. That morning, I measured it by intention. At 8 o'clock sharp, Margaret Ellis called to confirm that Daniel's attorney had responded to the formal objection. "They are emphasizing urgency," she explained. "They claim there are concerns about rapid cognitive fluctuation following your procedure." I almost smiled at the phrasing. Rapid cognitive fluctuation. As if I were a faulty appliance. And what is our response? I asked. Documentation, she said simply. We counter with medical evaluations, financial records, and testimony. After we ended the call, I drove myself to the independent clinic for the neurological assessment she had arranged. The receptionist handed me a clipboard with several pages of questions. I filled them out carefully, noting how many times in the past year I had driven without incident, paid bills on time, or attended community meetings. When the neurologist asked me to recall a series of numbers and draw a clock face from memory, I did so without hesitation. He asked about current events. I discussed the latest city council vote on property taxes and the stock market's performance over the past quarter. He looked mildly impressed. There is no evidence of impairment, he said at the end of the evaluation. Your cognitive function is well within normal range. I requested a printed copy of his findings before leaving. Paper mattered now. Back at home, Thomas was seated at the dining table reviewing additional trust documents he had retrieved from his office. There is something else you should see, he said quietly as I entered. He turned the folder toward me. Inside was a timeline of communication between Daniel and the trust administrator. Emails. Dates. Requests. I scanned them slowly. 3 weeks ago, Daniel had asked about accelerating a review of asset distribution. 2 days later, he inquired about medical documentation requirements for guardianship. The sequence was orderly, almost clinical. It was not spontaneous concern. It was a plan. He anticipated resistance, Thomas observed. He framed it as protection. I set the papers down carefully. Protection without consent is control, I said. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived alone. She stood in the doorway longer than usual before stepping inside, as if unsure of her footing. I did not know it would go this far, she began. I gestured for her to sit. Far from what? I asked. She folded her hands in her lap. Daniel said you were becoming forgetful. That you might need help. I thought it meant assistance, not court filings. I studied her expression. There was confusion there, but also avoidance. Did you read the petition? I asked gently. She shook her head. He told me it was standard. I nodded slowly. Standard for whom? Emily looked down at the table. I do not think he meant to hurt you. I considered that. Intent and impact are not the same. Intent does not erase consequence, I said quietly. You both left me in that hospital room believing decisions could be made without me. Her eyes filled, but I did not move to comfort her the way I once would have. Comfort is not the same as clarity. What happens now? She asked. Now, I replied, we proceed transparently. I showed her the medical evaluation. The documented emails. The trust structure Harold had established. She read in silence. When she finished, she exhaled slowly. He told me you might not pass the evaluation, she said. I met her gaze steadily. Then he does not know me very well. As evening approached, Daniel called again. This time his tone was sharper. You are complicating everything, he said. The hearing will damage our reputation. Reputation. I looked around my living room at the framed photographs of family vacations and school graduations. Reputation had always been built quietly through integrity, not expedited through paperwork. Reputation is strengthened by truth, I replied. If it is fragile, it was not solid to begin with. There was a long pause on the line. Are you choosing him over us? Daniel asked finally. The question revealed more than he intended. I am choosing facts over assumptions, I said calmly. If that feels like opposition, then perhaps you should examine why. He ended the call abruptly. I set the phone down and walked to the front window. The oak tree outside stood firm against the fading light, its branches outlined in gold by the setting sun. For years I believed that aging meant gradually stepping aside. Allowing younger voices to lead. But stepping aside is not the same as stepping down. Authority surrendered without question invites misuse. I turned back toward the kitchen table where the documents lay neatly arranged. The hearing was now 8 days away. Each day would add another layer of clarity. My children had built their case on perception and momentum. I was building mine on evidence and steadiness. And steadiness, once anchored, does not yield easily. The house was quiet that evening, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt deliberate. 8 days until the hearing. 8 days to let facts settle where assumptions had been. I sat at the dining table with Margaret Ellis on speakerphone and Thomas across from me, the folders arranged in neat stacks like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their edges. "We will submit the neurological evaluation tomorrow," Margaret said. "In addition, I recommend we request a review of all communication between Daniel and the trust administrator." I traced my finger lightly over Harold's signature on the original trust document. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the structure remained intact. "He built this carefully," I said. "He believed shared authority prevented misuse." Thomas nodded. "He anticipated concentration of power." The phrase lingered. Concentration of power. I thought of how subtle it had been. Daniel offering to consolidate my accounts for convenience. Laura suggesting automatic transfers so I would not have to remember due dates. Small steps presented as efficiency. Efficiency can become erasure when unchecked. The following morning I visited the bank personally. The branch manager, a man I had known for over a decade, greeted me with visible relief. "Mrs. Whitmore, we received inquiries regarding changes to beneficiary designations," he said quietly once we were seated in his office. We paused them pending verification. I appreciated that he had paused. "There will be no changes without my direct authorization," I replied. "In writing, witnessed, and notarized." He nodded immediately. "Of course." I reviewed each account line by line, confirming balances, signatures, and authorization levels. Nothing had been transferred yet, but the attempt had been documented. Attempt. The word did not carry emotion, only fact. When I returned home, Daniel's car was parked in the driveway again. This time he waited on the front porch rather than using the spare key. That detail did not escape me. "Mom," he began as I approached. His tone was less sharp than before, more measured. "We can still resolve this privately." I unlocked the door and stepped inside without responding, leaving it open for him to follow. In the living room, sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the framed photograph of Harold holding Daniel as a child. I gestured toward the sofa. "Resolve what, exactly?" I asked once we were seated. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The petition can be amended," he said. "We can shift it to a joint financial oversight arrangement. It would avoid court appearances." I studied his face carefully. This was negotiation, not concern. "Why is court appearance troubling?" I asked. He hesitated. "It creates a record." There it was again. Record. Documentation. Transparency. The very things I had begun to value. "A record protects everyone," I replied calmly. "Unless there is something you prefer undocumented." His jaw tightened slightly. "You are making this adversarial." "No," I said evenly. "I am making it accountable." He looked around the room as if seeing it differently for the first time. "Laura is worried about public perception," he admitted. "Investors watch these things." I felt a faint, almost distant sadness. Reputation had become currency. "Your father built his business on integrity," I said. "If investors are concerned about a transparent evaluation of my capacity, then perhaps their confidence is misplaced." Daniel stood and began pacing slowly across the rug. He had done the same thing at 17 when arguing about curfew. The difference now was not age, but authority. "I did not expect resistance," he said finally. "You have never resisted before." The honesty of that statement settled heavily between us. He was right. I had adjusted. compromised, yielded for the sake of harmony. I have never been petitioned before, I replied quietly. He stopped pacing. I thought you would trust me, he said. I met his gaze steadily. Trust requires disclosure. Silence followed. Not hostile. Just unvarnished. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. The hearing is in 7 days, he said. Our attorney will present evidence. And so will mine, I answered. He walked toward the door but paused before leaving. I never meant to make you feel alone, he said. I thought of the hospital room, the empty chair, the hum of fluorescent lights. Intent does not change experience, I replied. When he left, the house felt still again. I walked to the oak tree outside and stood beneath its branches, looking up at the canopy stretching nearly 50 feet above me. Harold and I had planted it believing we might never see it reach full height. Yet here it stood, stronger than either of us had been at its planting. Strength does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, year after year, ring by ring. Back inside, I organized the final stack of documents for Margaret Ellis. Medical evaluation. Bank confirmations. Email timeline. Trust provisions. Each page represented not aggression, but clarity. My children had assumed momentum would carry their plan forward. They had underestimated steadiness. The hearing was approaching, and with it, a formal examination of truth. I did not feel fear. I felt prepared. And preparation, once anchored in fact, does not tremble easily. The morning of the hearing arrived without drama. The sky was clear, pale blue stretching evenly above the courthouse downtown. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit I had worn to Harold's retirement dinner years ago. It fit the same. I took that as a quiet reassurance. Thomas picked me up at 8:30, and we drove the 15 miles into the city in steady silence. The courthouse stood firm and symmetrical, stone steps leading to wide glass doors that reflected the morning light. Daniel and Laura were already there when we entered the lobby. Daniel stood straight, expression composed, his attorney beside him flipping through a binder thick with tabs. Laura offered a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. Emily sat a few feet away, hands folded, looking uncertain. I nodded to each of them politely. There was no need for performance. Inside the courtroom, the air felt cool and structured. Wood paneling. Flags positioned precisely. Rows of benches polished smooth by years of quiet disputes. Margaret Ellis sat beside me, calm as ever, her documents arranged in neat order. When the judge entered, the room rose, and then everything began in measured cadence. Daniel's attorney spoke first. He described concern. He used phrases like proactive planning and safeguarding assets. He referenced my age more than once, as if 72 were an argument in itself. He cited the hospital procedure as evidence of vulnerability and mentioned isolated instances of forgetfulness. The words floated in the room, careful and strategic. When it was Margaret's turn, she did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She simply placed documents on the table one by one. The independent neurological evaluation confirming full cognitive capacity. The cardiologist's written statement noting no impairment. Bank confirmations verifying accurate account management. Email records outlining the timeline of Daniel's inquiries regarding asset transfer before my hospital stay. Each page was handed to the clerk and marked for the record. Record. The very thing Daniel had wished to avoid. The judge asked me directly whether I understood the proceedings. I met her gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor, I replied. I understand them completely. She asked whether I objected to the petition. I do, I said calmly. On the grounds that it was filed without my knowledge, based on incomplete representation of facts. There was no tremor in my voice. No anger. Only clarity. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. When the judge questioned him about the timing of the petition relative to my medical procedure, he hesitated. It was brief, but visible. We believed it was prudent, he said. Prudence typically involves consultation, the judge observed evenly. The hearing lasted less than an hour, yet it felt expansive in implication. When the judge finally spoke her decision, her tone remained measured. Based on the submitted evaluations and documentation, the court finds no evidence of cognitive incapacity. The petition for temporary guardianship is denied. The gavel struck once, firm but not dramatic. Denied. A single word, but it carried weight. I did not smile. I did not sigh with relief. I simply nodded. The record had been corrected. Outside the courtroom, Daniel approached me, his attorney stepping aside. This did not need to happen publicly, he said quietly. I looked at him steadily. It needed to happen accurately, I replied. Laura stood a few feet away, arms crossed lightly, expression tight. Emily walked toward me more slowly. I am sorry, she said, her voice low. I studied her face. Then learn from it, I answered gently. Apologies without adjustment are repetition. Thomas joined us near the courthouse steps. The sunlight outside felt warmer than it had that morning, though perhaps that was simply perspective. It is over, he said quietly. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied. It is clarified. There is a difference. Over suggests disappearance. Clarified suggests illumination. As we descended the stone steps, I paused briefly and looked back at the courthouse doors. The building stood unchanged, impartial and steady. Inside, facts had outweighed assumptions. Outside, life continued without spectacle. On the drive home, traffic moved steadily along the highway. I watched the city recede behind us and thought about the hospital room where this had begun. The empty chair. The fluorescent lights. The quiet hum of machines. My children had left believing I would remain unaware, perhaps even grateful for decisions made on my behalf. They had misjudged not my memory, but my resolve. When we reached my house, the oak tree cast its familiar shadow across the driveway. I stepped out of the car and looked up at its broad canopy, leaves shifting gently in the breeze. Strength does not shout. It does not announce itself with spectacle. It stands. It documents. It remains. Inside, I placed the final stamped court order into the metal box on the closet shelf beside Harold's original trust documents. The record was complete now. My children had attempted to redefine my authority through assumption. Instead, they had reinforced it through evidence. I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the ordinary act grounding and sufficient. I had not won a battle. I had corrected a narrative. And that correction would stand long after the echo of the gavel had faded.